I calculate risk for a living, but I never accounted for the liability sitting at my own dinner table. My parents swore the loan was just a temporary bridge, a small favor from the responsible child. Then the bank called at 2 in the afternoon. That money had not gone to repairs. It had bought my brother a shiny new car. They expected my silence. But this time, they handed me the knife. My name is Rachel Whitmore, and at 36 years old, I have built a career on the ability to predict disaster. I am a senior risk analyst for Sterling Point, a boutique consultancy firm where we advise mid-sized corporations on how to avoid bleeding out from unseen wounds. My office is a fortress of logic, a place where numbers do not lie and where every variable can be isolated, weighed, and mitigated. I am good at my job because I understand that security is just an illusion we purchase with vigilance. Yet, for all my professional paranoia, I have always been blind when walking through the front door of my parents' house. To my mother and father, I am not a complex woman with a demanding career and a solitary life that I have curated for peace. I am simply the stable one. I am the load-bearing wall that never complains about the weight. In contrast, my younger brother, Evan, is the decorative window that must be protected from every storm. Evan is 32, but in the emotional geography of our family, he has remained a perpetual adolescent, a fragile genius whose potential is always just one lucky break away from exploding. I have spent my adult life standing in the shadows with a checkbook. There was the time Evan needed bail money after a misunderstanding at a bar in college, which cost me $2,000. There was the graphic design startup that failed before it launched, costing me another $5,000 in equipment that now gathers dust in my parents' garage. Each time, I stepped in to smooth the waters, absorbing the financial shock so that our family dinners could remain pleasant and polite. I was the fixer, the one who scrubbed the stains out of the carpet so everyone else could pretend nothing had been spilled. That was why. 3 weeks ago, I found myself sitting at my parents' dining table, staring at a loan application. The air in the room had felt thick, smelling of pot roast and unspoken expectations. My father had pushed the papers toward me with a casualness that felt rehearsed. He explained that they had a temporary cash flow problem regarding the repairs on the rental property. They needed $50,000 to bridge the gap until the insurance payout arrived. Because their liquidity was tied up in other assets, they needed me to originate the loan. I remember feeling a cold prickle of unease at the base of my neck. In my professional life, an unsecured personal loan for someone else is a red flag the size of a billboard. I wanted to ask why they could not use a home equity line. I wanted to ask to see the contractor estimates. But I looked at my mother. She was watching me with that familiar, watery-eyed hope, her hands clasped tight. "It is just temporary. Rachel," she had said, her voice trembling slightly. "We would not ask if it were not an emergency. You know we are good for it." "Family is not about leverage," my father had added, his voice dropping to that serious, disappointed register he used whenever I tried to assert boundaries. "We help each other. You do not keep score with the people who raised you." The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until it became easier to just pick up the pen. I told myself I was being paranoid. These were my parents. They had paid for my piano lessons. They had co-signed my first apartment lease. I signed the document, forcing a smile I did not feel, and watched the relief wash over them. It was done. I was the good daughter again. But tonight, sitting alone in my quiet apartment with a glass of wine that has gone warm, that unease has returned. It is a persistent, gnawing sensation that forced me to open my laptop and download the digital copy of the loan agreement from the bank's portal. I wanted to reassure myself. I wanted to prove my anxiety wrong. I scrolled through the standard legal boilerplate, the definitions of default, and the interest rate schedules. My eyes were tired, but my training kicked in. I stopped at a section on the 4th page that I had skimmed over in the dim light of my parents' dining room. It was a clause regarding the authorized usage of funds. I had assumed it was standard restriction language. But as I read the fine print now, clearly illuminated by the harsh blue light of my screen, my breath hitched. The clause did not restrict the funds to property maintenance or renovation costs, as my father had implied. Instead, the loan was categorized under a much broader, flexible code that allowed for the purchase of personal motorized assets. I had signed off on a high-interest personal loan that explicitly permitted the purchase of vehicles. I stared at the words, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had never read that line. Or maybe I had, and I simply chose not to see it. The dealership, a glass-walled temple to excess located in the fictional coastal enclave of Azure Bay, smelled of fresh espresso and premium leather. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the sunlight reflected off the polished hoods of German engineering with an intensity that made my eyes ache. My parents had framed this trip as a family outing, a vague celebration of good news that they had refused to specify over the phone. Standing there in my sensible beige trench coat, holding a complimentary bottle of sparkling water, I felt like an undercover agent at a crime scene. My father stood in the center of the showroom floor, his arm draped around my brother's shoulders. Evan was wearing a fitted blazer and loafers that likely cost more than my monthly utility bill. He looked radiant, possessing that specific glow of a man who has never truly faced a consequence. A sales associate, a young man with teeth that were too white, handed my father a heavy key fob. My father, with a theatrical flourish, passed it to Evan. "To new beginnings," my father announced, his voice booming enough to attract the attention of a couple browsing convertibles nearby. "We are so proud of the man you are becoming. Son, you needed a vehicle that matches your ambition." Evan gripped the keys, his face flushed with triumph. He turned to the small gathering of our family, my parents, myself, and our Uncle Jerry who lived nearby, and gave a shrug that was meant to look humble. "I appreciate it, Dad," Evan said. "It has been a grind getting my consulting business off the ground, but it pays off when you stay focused. This car is just the first step. It is a tool for the image I need to project." I watched this performance with the stillness of a statue. My gaze drifted past my brother's self-satisfied grin to the window sticker of the charcoal gray sports sedan he was leaning against. The base price, combined with the sport package and the destination fee, came to a total of $49,500. Once the sales tax and registration fees were calculated, the final number would sit almost exactly at $50,000. The number was not a coincidence. It was a match. A cold, mathematical clarity washed over me. The $50,000 I had signed for, the money that was explicitly earmarked for emergency structural repairs on their rental property, was sitting on 4 rubber tires in front of me. "That is a hell of a ride," Uncle Jerry said, whistling low as he kicked the tires lightly. "Must have set you back a fortune, Bob. I thought you said cash was tight with that roof repair on the duplex." My father did not even blink. He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture he had perfected over decades of bending reality to his will. "Oh, we moved some things around. Family resources. Jerry, we prioritize. The roof can hold for another winter, but Evan needed reliable transportation to meet clients now. It is an investment in his future." "Family resources," my mother echoed, beaming at Evan. She avoided looking in my direction. "We all pitch in. That is what we do." They had scrubbed me out of the narrative completely. It was not my credit score on the line. It was not my signature on the promissory note. In their version of history, this was just money that had appeared by magic, summoned by their benevolence. Evan was the hero for accepting the gift, and they were the saints for providing it. I was just the audience. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to laugh, but I swallowed it down. It tasted like bile. I could have stepped forward. I could have asked, loudly and clearly, why the emergency loan I secured was being driven out of a showroom lot. I could have shattered the scene right there, but I did not. That was not how I operated. I did not make moves based on anger. I made them based on evidence. Evan opened the driver's side door and revved the engine. The sound was a guttural roar that filled the space. My mother clapped her hands in delight. "Get in, Rachel!" Evan shouted over the engine, waving at me. "I will take you for a spin. You can see what real success feels like." "I am fine," I said, my voice steady. "I will wait here." As they busied themselves admiring the leather stitching, I felt a vibration in my coat pocket. I pulled out my phone. The screen was dark, but a notification lingered from a missed call that had come in just seconds ago. It was a number I did not have saved, but the caller ID displayed a name that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. First Horizon Bank, Fraud Prevention Department. I looked at the phone, then at my parents, who were laughing as Evan adjusted the rearview mirror. They thought they had pulled off the perfect maneuver. They had no idea that the call I just missed was the first domino tipping over. I slid the phone back into my pocket and waited. I sat at my kitchen island, the blue light of my laptop screen cutting through the darkness of my apartment. It was 8 o'clock at night, and the silence around me felt heavy, charged with the static of impending realization. I had listened to the voicemail from First Horizon Bank 3 times. The voice was polite, professional, and terrifyingly specific. They needed to verify the identity of the third-party beneficiary regarding the recent disbursement on my personal loan account. I did not call my parents. In the past, that would have been my first reflex. I would have called my mother, heard her frantic explanations, and allowed myself to be guilted into fixing the mess. But I was not a daughter tonight. I was an analyst. I opened a new spreadsheet. I treated the situation exactly as I would a failing corporate portfolio. Step 1 was data acquisition. I logged into the secure banking portal. My fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision. I pulled up the transaction history for the loan account. The principal amount, $50,000, had been disbursed 2 days ago. I scanned the destination field. It was not a deposit into my parents' joint checking account, as we had discussed for the supposed roof repairs. The funds had been wired directly to a commercial entity. The recipient was listed clearly, Azure Bay Luxury Imports. I stared at the screen. The logic was irrefutable. My loan had paid for the car directly, but banks do not simply wire $50,000 to a car dealership based on a verbal request. There had to be documentation. I navigated to the Documents and Correspondence tab. There were the initial papers I had signed, the ones I had skimmed over. But there was a new file, uploaded 48 hours after the initial signing. It was labeled Disbursement Authorization Addendum. I clicked Download. The PDF opened. It was a request to bypass the primary borrower's account and pay a vendor directly. At the bottom of the page was my digital signature. It looked exactly like the one I used, identical to the pixel. I checked the metadata of the signature. It was time-stamped at 10:30 in the morning on Tuesday. On Tuesday at 10:30 in the morning, I had been in a compliance meeting with 3 senior partners at my firm. I had not been near a computer. I had not authorized anything. The realization hit me, but it did not feel like heartbreak. It felt like a drop in temperature. The pain of seeing Evan with the car was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. My parents had not just borrowed money and used it poorly. They had accessed my account using my personal information. Likely the login credentials I had foolishly saved on their home computer years ago during a tax season. They had impersonated me. They had forged a digital authorization to buy a toy for their golden child. I looked at the screen, and for the first time in my life, I did not see my mother and father. I saw hostile actors. I saw fraud. I began to save everything. I did not just take screenshots. I downloaded the full audit trail of the account activity. I saved the IP addresses of the logins that had occurred while I was at work. I created a folder on my encrypted external hard drive and moved every piece of evidence into it. I named the folder with the current date, just as I would for a case file at work. My hand hovered over my phone. The instinct to scream at them was there, buried deep under the ice. But I crushed it. If I called them now, They would spin a story. They would cry. They would talk about how they intended to pay me back, how it was just a shortcut to help Evan. They would try to make me an accomplice to their deception. I pulled my hand back. I was not going to give them the warning. I was not going to let them negotiate. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I would not call the bank back tonight. I would wait until morning. I would let the system grind forward on its own gears. When the bank called me again, I would not be the confused daughter trying to cover for her family. I would answer the phone as Rachel Whitmore, the risk analyst, and I would tell them the truth. My phone rang at exactly 9:15 in the morning. I was seated at my desk, surrounded by dual monitors displaying market volatility charts, but my focus was entirely on the device vibrating against the mahogany surface. The caller ID displayed the same number from the previous night. I picked it up on the second ring, my voice practiced and steady. "This is Rachel Whitmore," I said. "Ms. Whitmore, this is David Sterling from the Risk Control Department at First Horizon Bank." The voice on the other end replied. He sounded brisk, devoid of the sales warmth that usually accompanies banking interactions. "This call is being recorded for quality and security purposes. I need to verify a few security questions before we proceed." I went through the standard protocol, reciting my date of birth and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I did not rush. I let the silence between our words sit heavy and cold. "Thank you," David said. "We are flagging a transaction on your personal loan account ending in 4589. A wire transfer of $50,000 was authorized 48 hours ago to a vendor listed as Azure Bay Luxury Imports. We have an electronic signature on file authorizing a direct disbursement to this third party. Ms. Whitmore, did you personally authorize this transaction?" This was the moment. I looked out the window at the gray city skyline. I could have stalled. I could have asked for more time. But the image of Evan leaning against that charcoal sedan, soaking up the praise that was bought with my credit, flashed in my mind. "No," I said clearly. "I did not authorize that transaction. I did not sign a disbursement addendum, and I did not give permission for the funds to be sent to a car dealership." There was a pause on the line, the sound of typing echoing faintly in the background. "I see. Ms. Whitmore, I need to be very specific about what this implies. Since the authorization was completed using your verified login credentials, we are looking at 2 possibilities. One is external account compromise. The other, which is statistically more probable in these cases, involves unauthorized access by a known associate or family member. In the industry, we call this familial fraud." "I am aware of the terminology," I cut in. "I work in risk analysis." "Then you understand the gravity," David continued, his tone shifting from investigative to advisory. "If you confirm that this usage was unauthorized, we classify this as identity theft. However, if there was any verbal agreement, or if you shared your credentials, you could face joint liability for the debt. We need to know if you wish to dispute this formally. Initiating a fraud claim is a trigger event. It invalidates the current loan agreement and launches an external investigation." I did not share my credentials. I lied. Technically, I had not shared them recently, though I had failed to scrub them from a shared computer years ago. That was negligence, perhaps, but it was not permission. The access was unauthorized. The signature is a forgery. I am formally disputing the transaction. "Understood," David said. "We are locking the account effective immediately. The funds transferred to Azure Bay Luxury Imports will be recalled pending the investigation. If the dealer has already released the asset, they will be notified that the funding has been flagged as fraudulent. This will freeze any title processing. I want a transcript of this call and a written confirmation of the dispute sent to my secure email within the hour," I said. "I also want the case number and the direct contact information for the legal team assigned to this file." "I will generate that for you now," he replied. "Expect an email in 10 minutes, Ms. Whitmore. Once this process starts, it is difficult to stop. The bank is required to file a report. Send the email David, I said. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk. The silence of the office rushed back in, but the world felt different than it had 5 minutes ago. I had just pulled a lever that would dismantle the facade my parents had built. By freezing the funds, the dealership would call my father. The bank would call my father. The police might eventually call my father. I adjusted the cuffs of my blouse and turned back to my monitors. I had crossed the line from being a passive victim to an active prosecutor. There was no going back to the dinner table now. I had just declared war, and I had done it with the professional detachment of a stranger. The adrenaline from the call with the bank began to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest that felt dangerously like grief. I sat in my ergonomic office chair, staring at the frozen rows of data on my screen, but my mind was drifting backward, pulling up a catalog of memories I had suppressed for years. This was not the first time I had paid for peace in the Whitmore household. I remembered my 25th birthday. I had been working 2 jobs to save for a down payment on a condo. I came home for dinner, expecting a celebration. Instead, my mother had cried over a burnt roast, explaining that Evan had been arrested for a DUI in a neighboring county. The legal fees were going to be astronomical. They did not ask me directly. They never did. They just laid the tragedy out on the table and waited for me to pick it up. I gave them $4,000 that night. It was my entire furniture budget. My father had hugged me, his eyes dry and serious, and told me I was the glue holding us together. Evan got a lawyer and a slap on the wrist. I got a mattress on the floor of an empty apartment. The pattern was so clear now that it was humiliating. I was the infrastructure. Evan was the occupant. I was the one who ensured the lights stayed on so he could shine. When Evan wanted to study photography in Europe, my parents refinanced their mortgage. When I graduated summa cum laude, I received a card and a firm handshake. You are stronger than him, Rachel. My father had said those words to me on the front porch the day I left for college. I remember the smell of rain and old wood. At the time, I wore the sentence like a medal. I thought it meant he respected me. I thought he saw my resilience as a virtue. Now, sitting in the cold fluorescent light of my office, the words twisted into something ugly. It was not a compliment. It was a justification. They told me I was strong so they would not have to feel guilty about leaning on me until I cracked. They told me I was strong so they could be weak for Evan. I shook my head, physically forcing the memories back into the dark. Emotion was a variable I could not control, so I returned to what I could: the math. I opened a new tab on my spreadsheet and began to construct a timeline of the fraud. I placed the loan origination date in the first column. Then I cross-referenced it with the activity logs from my primary checking account, which was linked to the loan for automatic payments. I had assumed the damage was limited to the $50,000 loan. I was wrong. I traced the digital footprints backward. 2 weeks before the loan was finalized, there was a debit of $500 listed as a reservation deposit at Azure Bay Luxury Imports. It had been pulled directly from my checking account. Because I rarely used that specific account for daily spending, I had missed the notification. 3 days later, there was another charge, $1,200 for dealer-added accessories. My hands started to tremble, not from sadness, but from a rage that felt cold and precise. They had not just applied for the loan in my name. They had been using my account as a piggy bank to set the stage for the purchase. They had tested the waters with smaller amounts to see if I would notice. When I remained silent, they took it as permission to launch the main attack. I summed the columns. The principal of the loan was $50,000. The unauthorized debits from my checking account totaled nearly $2,000. But then I saw the interest projection. Because the loan was categorized as high risk due to the rapid disbursement, the rate was significantly higher than what I would have qualified for with a standard application. I looked at the final number at the bottom of the screen. The cost of their betrayal was not just the price of a luxury sedan. Between the stolen cash, the loan principal, and the projected interest over the life of the term. The figure was staggering. They had burdened me with a liability that exceeded $65,000. They had done this while smiling at me over Christmas dinner. They had done this while telling me they loved me. I closed the laptop with a snap. The time for feeling hurt was over. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for my personal attorney, a woman named Sarah who was as sharp as a scalpel. I was done being the strong one. I was ready to be the dangerous one. I treated the screen before me like a crime scene. In my line of work, we call this a forensic audit, but tonight it felt more like an autopsy of my relationship with my parents. I pulled the raw data from the loan portal and exported it into my proprietary analysis software. I needed to see the skeleton of the transaction, stripped of all sentiment and excuses. I started by tracing the modification history of the loan. Most people assume a loan is a static agreement, but digital lending platforms allow for adjustments if you have the right credentials. I found a log entry from 3 days ago, time-stamped at 2 in the morning. Someone had accessed the account and requested a term restructuring. The original agreement I had signed was for a standard 36-month repayment plan. The new term, approved instantly by the algorithm, was stretched to 72 months. I stared at the numbers. By doubling the length of the loan, they had lowered the monthly payment to something Evan could ostensibly afford with his sporadic income. But in doing so, they had nearly tripled the total interest payable over the life of the loan. They had sold my long-term financial health for a lower monthly bill. It was a classic predatory move, the kind I warned my corporate clients against every day. But how had I missed the notification banks are legally required to notify the borrower of term changes? I navigated to the Profile Settings tab. My breath caught in my throat. The contact email address had been altered. It was no longer my work email. It had been changed to a generic Gmail address that looked deceptively similar to my own, differing by only a single character. I opened a separate browser window and ran a quick domain search. That email address had been created 4 days ago. The recovery phone number linked to it ended in the digits 8812. That was my father's cell phone number. This was the smoking gun. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a panicked decision made in the heat of the moment. This was premeditation. My father had created a fake email account to intercept the bank's security alerts. He had deliberately built a digital wall to keep me blind while he dismantled my credit. I compiled everything into a single encrypted zip file. I included the IP address logs, the timeline of the email modification, and the restructuring approval that lacked my biometric verification. I picked up the phone and dialed the direct extension for David Sterling. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Sterling, this is Rachel Whitmore," I said. My voice was devoid of tremors. "I have just uploaded a supplementary evidence package to the secure portal. You need to look at file labeled Exhibit B." I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on his end. A moment of silence stretched out, heavy and absolute. "I am looking at it now," David said. His tone had shifted. The polite customer service edge was gone, replaced by the sharp, serious tone of a compliance officer who realizes he is looking at a felony. "You have documented a change of contact information that predates the disbursement." "Correct," I said. "The recovery number for the fraudulent email belongs to the same individual who took possession of the vehicle. This establishes intent to conceal. It proves that the borrower was deliberately bypassed." "Ms. Whitmore," David said slowly, "this changes the categorization of the file. This is no longer a civil dispute or a familial misunderstanding. The evidence of the email spoofing pushes this into the realm of criminal identity fraud. We are required by federal regulations to escalate this." "I understand the regulations." "David," I replied, "do what you have to do." "I am transferring this file to our legal and compliance division immediately," he stated. "They will be filing a suspicious activity report with the relevant authorities. We are also initiating the asset recovery process. The dealership will be contacted within the hour." I hung up the phone. The silence in my apartment was deafening. My parents had gambled everything on the assumption that I would be too soft to look at the details, or too loyal to act on them. They thought they were just moving money around. They did not realize that by changing that email address, they had turned a family favor into a federal crime. They had pushed the button, but I was the one who had just locked the doors. I walked into my parents' house with a manila folder tucked under my arm. It felt less like a collection of papers and more like a loaded weapon. The smell of pot roast filled the hallway, a scent that used to mean comfort but now smelled like deception. My mother was setting the table, humming a tune, while my father poured wine. Evan was already seated, scrolling through his phone, looking bored and expensive in a new cashmere sweater that I suspected I had also unknowingly paid for. "Rachel, you are late," my mother said, offering a cheek for me to kiss. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. The rejection made her freeze, her smile faltering. I did not sit down. I stood at the head of the table, gripping the back of my father's empty chair. "We need to talk about the loan," I said. My voice was low, devoid of the warmth they expected. My father chuckled, though the sound was tight. "Not before dinner, Rachel. Let's eat first. We can discuss finances later." "There is nothing to discuss about finances," I replied. "We need to discuss fraud." The room went silent. Evan looked up from his phone, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Jesus, Rachel, did you come here just to start drama? It is just a loan. Dad said he would handle the payments." "You make plenty of money. Why are you acting like this is a tragedy?" "It is not a loan, Evan," I said, looking directly at him. "It is theft, and I did not agree to buy you a car." "It was a misunderstanding," my mother interjected quickly, her hands fluttering nervously near the silverware. "We intended to tell you, Rachel, truly. But things moved so fast at the dealership, and your father thought it would be a nice surprise for your brother. We were going to restructure the payments ourselves." "A surprise," I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Is that what we are calling it? Because the bank calls it identity theft. The bank calls it forgery." I threw the folder onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and hit the wine bottle with a sharp clink. "That is the audit trail," I said, pointing a shaking finger at the pile. "It shows the IP address where the loan terms were changed. It shows the fake email address you created. Dad, you logged in at 2 in the morning and impersonated me to extend the term to 72 months, just so the monthly payment would look lower. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a calculated crime." My father slammed his hand on the table, making the plates jump. His face turned a mottled red. "Watch your tone. I am your father. I made a command decision for the good of this family. You were busy with your career, always too busy to help. So I did what had to be done. We are a family. We share assets." "My identity is not a shared asset," I shouted back, my composure finally cracking. "My credit score is not a community pot for you to dip into whenever Evan wants a new toy." "You are being selfish," Evan sneered. "I needed that car for my image. You have no idea how hard it is to build a brand. You sit in an office all day pushing buttons. You should be happy to help me." I looked at them. My mother was now weeping softly into her napkin, playing the martyr. My father was glaring at me with self-righteous fury. Evan was looking at me with pure contempt. They did not see me as a person. They saw me as a resource. "I spoke to the fraud department this morning," I said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I gave them everything, the logs, the emails, the proof that I was not the one who signed that addendum. My mother stopped crying. She looked up, her eyes wide with genuine fear. "Rachel, what did you do?" "I disputed the charges," I said. "The account is frozen. The funds are being recalled." "You did what?" my father roared, standing up. "Do you have any idea what that will do? They will call the police. They will come for the car." "Yes," I said. "They will—" "Fix it," my father demanded, pointing a finger at my face. You call them back right now and tell them it was a mistake. You tell them you authorized it. Do not destroy your brother's future over a clerical error." "It is not a clerical error," I said. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me, the kind that comes after the worst has already happened. I am done, Dad. I am done paying for Evan's mistakes. I am done being the safety net. "You are destroying this family," my mother wailed. "No," I said, turning toward the door. "I am just refusing to pay the bill for it." "If you walk out that door, do not come back," my father threatened, his voice shaking with rage. I stopped at the threshold and looked back at them one last time. They looked small, angry, and terrified. "I am not saving you anymore," I said. I opened the door and walked out into the cool night air. Behind me, I heard the sound of glass shattering, but I did not flinch. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving the chaos exactly where it belonged. The machinery of institutional justice moves with a grinding, indifferent noise that I found strangely comforting. 48 hours after I left my parents' dinner table, the investigation formally shifted from an internal review to an active fraud case. First Horizon Bank did not care about the sentimental history of the Whitmore family. They only cared about the $50,000 that had been misappropriated. My parents were unprepared for the reality of what they had unleashed. They expected a family squabble that could be smoothed over with apologies or guilt trips. Instead, they received certified letters from the bank's legal department requiring a sworn affidavit explaining the origin of the digital signature. They were being asked, in legal terms, to confess to a felony or to perjure themselves in writing. The pressure began to mount immediately. My phone became a device of harassment. I received 32 missed calls from my mother in a single day. Her text messages cycled wildly between pleading for mercy and accusing me of being a vindictive daughter who had lost her soul. She sent photos of us from childhood, grainy images of happier times, captioned with messages about loyalty and blood. I did not reply. I archived every message into the evidence folder on my laptop. I had effectively ceased to exist as their daughter. To them, I was now only a witness for the prosecution. I directed all communication to David Sterling at the bank. When my father tried to show up at my office building, security turned him away at the lobby turnstiles because I had removed his name from my guest list. It was a cold move, but necessary. I knew that if I looked him in the eyes, he would try to use the old levers of authority to make me fold. The isolation of my parents was swift. In our tight-knit community, secrets have a way of leaking like gas. Uncle Jerry called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice hushed and awkward. He had heard that the police had visited my parents' house to verify residency for the fraud report. He wanted to know if everything was all right. I told him simply that it was a legal matter and I could not discuss it. That non-denial was enough to confirm the worst. The rumor mill spun into high gear. The perfect family that my parents had curated for decades began to crack. Neighbors stopped waving. The invitation to the annual country club gala, which my mother prized above all else, mysteriously failed to arrive. Evan was the one who began to unravel first. The dealership had contacted him, informing him that the title processing for the vehicle had been suspended due to a funding dispute. He was driving a car that he did not legally own and could not register. The symbol of his success had become a tracking beacon for his failure. He sent me a single email, devoid of subject line. It just said that I was ruining his life over money I did not even need. He still did not get it. He thought this was about greed. He could not grasp that it was about consent. I sat in my apartment on Friday evening, watching the rain streak against the glass. The silence was no longer heavy, it was protective. I had built a fortress of boundaries, and for the first time the walls were holding. My parents were learning a lesson they should have been taught 30 years ago. Actions have consequences that cannot be paid for with someone else's credit card. Then the notification chimed on my laptop. It was an email from David Sterling. The subject line was stark and capitalized. Final determination of fraud claim. I hovered my mouse over the email. The investigation was closed. The bank had made its decision on how to proceed. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I clicked open the message that would decide the fate of my family. The email from David Sterling contained an attachment that felt heavier than the laptop itself. It was a waiver of criminal prosecution. The bank, understanding the delicate nature of familial fraud, offered me a final exit ramp. If I signed the document stating that the transaction was the result of a domestic misunderstanding regarding verbal authorization, they would close the fraud investigation. The debt would revert to my name, leaving me liable for the $50,000 plus interest, but my parents would avoid federal charges. It was a classic settlement offer. I could buy their freedom with my financial future. I sat with the document open on my screen for 20 minutes before my phone rang. It was Evan. I almost let it go to voicemail, but a morbid curiosity made me slide the answer button. "Rachel," he said. His voice was unrecognizable. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a wet, ragged fear. "Rachel, please. Dad told me about the waiver. You have to sign it." "I do not have to do anything." "Evan," I said, my voice flat. "I am sorry," he blurted out. It was the first time in 32 years that I had heard those words leave his mouth without a qualifier. "I am so sorry. I did not know they stole your identity. I thought you gave them the money. I swear, I just wanted the car. I did not want this." I listened to his breathing. He sounded like a child who had broken a vase and was terrified of the broom. For a second, I felt a flicker of pity. He was a product of their enabling just as much as I was a product of their neglect. But then I heard my mother's voice in the background, muffled but sharp. "Give me the phone," she demanded. There was a scuffling sound, and then she was on the line. "Rachel, this has gone far enough. You have made your point. You have scared us. Now sign the paper. We can work out a payment plan later. Do not destroy your father's life over pride." The pity evaporated instantly. Even now, staring down the barrel of a felony indictment, she was not asking for forgiveness. She was demanding compliance. She still believed that my role on this earth was to absorb the impact of their collisions. She called it pride. I called it survival. "It is not pride, Mom," I said. "It is justice. We are family," she screamed, her voice cracking. "We made a mistake. We were going to pay it back. Why are you being so cold? When did you become this monster?" I closed my eyes. I thought about the bail money I paid when I was 25. I thought about the nights I spent eating ramen so I could lend them cash for repairs that never happened. I thought about the way they looked at Evan with adoration and looked at me with expectation. They did not love me. They loved my utility. If I signed that waiver, I would be telling them that their love was conditional on my submission. I would be accepting the debt not just in dollars, but in dignity. "I did not become a monster," I said softly. "I became an adult. Rachel, if you do not sign this, they will come for your father tomorrow." She sobbed. "Please." The choice was binary. I could save them and destroy myself, or I could save myself and let them fall. For years, I had chosen them. I had chosen the path of least resistance. I had chosen to be the good daughter who cleaned up the mess. I looked at the cursor hovering over the decline button on the bank's secure portal. "I am sorry, Mom," I said. "But the answer is no." "Rachel," she shrieked. I hung up the phone. I did not just close the browser tab. I opened the reply window to David Sterling. I typed a single sentence, devoid of emotion or hesitation. I decline the waiver and request that First Horizon Bank proceed with the full extent of the legal process regarding the identity theft and fraud committed against my account. I hit send. The message vanished into the server, carrying the fate of the Whitmore family with it. I sat back in my chair and waited for the explosion. But for the first time in my life, the silence in the room did not feel lonely. It felt free. I did not sign the waiver. That refusal was the only signature that mattered. By declining the settlement offer, I removed the final barrier holding back the flood, and the waters of consequence rushed in with devastating speed. First Horizon Bank did not hesitate. Within 48 hours of my email to David Sterling, the asset recovery team was dispatched to my parents' driveway. I was not there to see it, but the description I received from Uncle Jerry was vivid enough. It happened on a Tuesday morning. A flatbed tow truck pulled up to the curb, flanked by a local sheriff's deputy who was there to ensure the peace. Evan came running out of the house in his pajamas, shouting about his rights and his image. He tried to block the driver, but the deputy stepped in. My parents stood on the porch, pale and trembling, as the charcoal gray sedan was hooked up and dragged onto the bed of the truck. The neighbors, the ones my mother had spent 30 years impressing, stood behind their curtains and watched the Whitmore family dignity being hauled away to an impound lot. The legal fallout was just as efficient. Because I had cooperated fully and provided the forensic evidence of the IP spoofing, the bank formally successfully reversed the liability. The $50,000 plus interest was stripped from my credit report. It was no longer my debt. It was now a criminal case of identity theft and wire fraud against my father. He avoided prison time only because of his age and a plea deal that required full restitution and a permanent mark on his record. His credit score was obliterated. The refinancing options he had relied on for years vanished overnight. They were now financially paralyzed, forced to live within the actual means they had ignored for decades. Evan lost more than just the car. He lost the illusion. Without the vehicle to prop up his consulting facade, his clients evaporated. He was back in his childhood bedroom, bitter and grounded, stripped of the unearned status he had flaunted in my face. The symbol of his success had been repossessed, leaving him with nothing but the reality of his own mediocrity. People often ask if revenge feels sweet. It does not. Sweetness implies pleasure, and I felt no pleasure in watching my family collapse. But it did not feel bitter, either. It felt like correcting a balance sheet that had been in the red for too long. It felt like the quiet satisfaction of a complex equation finally resolving to zero. I sat in my apartment on Friday evening, watching the rain streak against the glass. The silence was no longer heavy. It was protective. I had built a fortress of boundaries, and for the first time, the walls were holding. My parents were learning a lesson they should have been taught 30 years ago. Actions have consequences that cannot be paid for with someone else's credit card. Then the notification chimed on my laptop. It was an email from David Sterling. The subject line was stark and capitalized. Final determination of fraud claim. I hovered my mouse over the email. The investigation was closed. The bank had made its decision on how to proceed. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I clicked open the message that would decide the fate of my family. I sat in my apartment a month later, holding a glass of wine. My phone screen lit up. It was a new number, but I knew who it was. My mother was calling, likely from a burner phone or a neighbor's landline, desperate to guilt me back into the fold. She wanted to cry. She wanted to ask how I could sleep at night. I looked at the phone. I did not feel the old panic. I did not feel the urge to fix it. I felt light. For the first time in 36 years, I was not the load-bearing wall. I was just Rachel. I was a woman who owned her own name, her own money, and her own life. I pressed the side button on my phone, silencing the ring. Then I held the power button down until the screen went black. The room was quiet. I took a sip of wine and looked out at the city lights. I was finally free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I am really curious to know where you are all tuning in from, so please drop a comment below, sharing your location and your thoughts on whether you think I made the right choice. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Mira Revenge Stories, hit that like button, and give us a hype to help this video get recommended to more people who need to hear it.